Well, good morning, Dr. Gertson. It is good to have the good to have the opportunity to try to present to you a very difficult subject. I'll be talking about David Hume, who this man was, what his philosophy was, why he is so important, and how he has impacted how we view the world in which we live in, especially his influence on Western culture. And so we'll spend some time over the next hour, maybe hour and a half, talking about his understanding of reason, how it relates to reality, how it relates to religion and the Bible, and all kinds of things that were really festering at this point during the 1700s in Scotland and England in the West. We see really the beginning of what we call the Enlightenment. And David Hume is in the middle of that whole discussion. And really, I think David Hume represents a transition away from what we would call the old rationalism of medieval science that started with Christian ideas of scholasticism that began with the Catholic Church, and they started to recover Aristotle's thinking. They used Aristotle's categories in order to systematize doctrine, to systematize knowledge, and this led to an early version of what we call the scientific revolution. And the early scientific revolution in, like, say, 1500s, 1600s was more rationally oriented. After Hume, it becomes more empirically oriented. And we'll talk about this transition, how exactly, what does that mean? What's it all about? How does this all happen? And so we'll spend some time doing that. So why don't we start talking about a few of our slides here? I think, assuming you can see everything here, and we will talk about how David Hume is really like a door hinge. He goes from what we call the classic Christian sciences, knowledge is power, rationalism, and science. And then we go from that to what we call today empiricism. And with the old school, the old Catholic scholasticism, the old rationalistic view of science, what we have is knowledge is power. And they wanted to use rationalism, reason, in order to exert power over the world in which they live in. That was the original idea of how we are to use science. Knowledge was power. It was not something theoretical. So knowledge was something to be used practically in our lives. Now with empiricism, after that time, what we were talking about then is that knowledge strictly is not power per se. Very interesting, although they sort of didn't really think about this too clearly. After Hume, basically what they want to do is use their own reason according to their own standards, and they're going to use it according to their own experience. So before Hume, we have a rationalism that's based on a transcendent view of the world. God made the world. He is the creator of the world. He made the world, to be maintained by rational, natural laws. That's what they assumed. And the creation exemplifies those rules, those laws. Maybe better to say laws rather than rules. Yet, in some verses in the Old Testament, we have that, God uses nature as his ordinances, that they are ordained. And of course, they got caught up in a lot of math before empiricism became more popular with the view of God created the world. They started to have interest in math, how we can calculate things with regard to the world in which we live in. Of course, we have all kinds of things in nature to calculate. And of course, even in the Bible, we have Isaiah chapter 40, who can measure the stars, and who can measure water in your hands. And we have similar, who can count all of the sands, the sand pebbles that are out there, the sand dust, and of course the stars, how do you count all of them? The Bible talks about these things. So the Bible teaches that God's creative infinite power is exemplified by the things that he has made. So the original scientists assumed that they were generally working within the Judeo-Christian worldview. They accepted God was transcendent. He was the creator, and he made that world according to rational laws, which we would like to examine more closely. That was sort of the original desire to study the universe in which we live in. Now, after Hume, we have a transition from rationalism to what we call empiricism, where only experience alone, apart from transcendence, apart from God, apart from anything that we might consider to be metaphysical, only my experience and my worldview and the world that I live in, this will become the basis for truth. Because there is a problem. Of course, we have lots of superstitious ideas, right, that are not true. Science, of course, wants to get rid of these superstitious ideas. And so this became more and more popular. They wanted to get rid of the old rationalistic models, the old rationalism, which you may have used logic, and maybe your logic is excellent, but it represents nothing in reality. It's just sort of a logic that's uprooted from the real world, the real experiential world we live in. So this is part of the whole discussion here. They want to root knowledge in reality. And rationalism had a tendency to make things a little bit abstract, or maybe a little bit is probably being too generous, too abstract. And sometimes they became also superstitious, especially with, Catholicism was, even though it was based on Aristotle's categories, yet it was very superstitious in many ways. And so we have lots of things going on here. How do we know that what we know is true? And so David Hume is going to root everything into our own experience and what may be transcendentally out there. He says he doesn't know. He's an agnostic. He's not necessarily what we call an atheist, although I think he actually was in terms of what he actually taught and what he actually taught and what he said and what he actually believed. I think probably are two different things. There are lots of pressures in those days. You don't want to admit you're an atheist. So he was sort of an agnostic deist of sorts, and he's going to get rid of all that trend. He simply says we don't know about it. We can't know anything about it. And there's a truth in there. Okay, without the Bible, how can we know something transcendent? There's verses on this. Solomon talks about this problem in the book of Ecclesiastes. Even Proverbs brings up this question too. So this is not something that we should be surprised at. It's just that Hume says that there was no transcendental answers out there that have come down to us, and that everything is experiential, and he doubts anything transcendent. And this has become really the hallmark of what we call today modern empiricism. There can be no transcendent understanding of things which transcend the material world in which we live. We have to focus exclusively on our experience today. And this, of course, is the point of empiricism. We observe things today. So let's go through some of these slides. And then I'm going to ask you to print out a sheet of notes. I have a student here, a student sheet. I want you to print that out. And we have two sheets. And Hume is a very difficult subject, and I will try to simplify it as much as I can with the actual outline teaching. We'll kind of get into some details that may or may not interest you. I'll try to do my best to make it interesting as much as possible. But the main things that I want you to understand from the lecture will be what we record here in the outline here. And I have the answers, the teacher outline, and then you're going to fill in the answers as I tell you what they are. So let's start with our slides here. And let's take a look at David Hume. Let's get a little history. Historical background is always important. And this is critical understanding anybody, and including the scriptures. And by the way, the Bible was written in history. And so we too need to study the scriptures historically in context to understand God's plan, because he has revealed himself historically. And our interest in history, even though we don't get credit for this, today in our modern Western culture, a lot of it goes back to the Bible, because the Bible wrote the book on history. It goes from beginning to end, all the way from Genesis to Revelation and everything in between. And so the interest in history is something which is God-given. Of course, we know from Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so in the beginning there we have time. And of course, God made something. He made the heavens and the earth. And so in space, God made matter. And he did that in time, and all those things are concurrent. And so, the idea of space and time, Hume spent time talking about space and time, and of course Kant did as well. And really the Bible provides the basis for such thinking, even though we don't give credit to the Bible for its historical consciousness, which has given us to the West. David Hume was born in 1711. He died in 76. He wrote a number of works, but his two most famous books are the Treatise of Human Nature, written in 1739. He wrote this anonymously because at this time it was an agnostic book. And of course, in England, you have the Protestant Reformation. In Scotland, you have the, Knox's Calvinist Reformation there. It's even a little bit stronger. And so he was, he did not want people to know his views. He wrote a book. He wanted people to think about it, but he didn't want to have to be subjected to all the criticisms. And then in 1748, here he puts his name on it. This is called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. This book is actually a little compendium. It's smaller. And this sort of, people knew that he wrote the first book. It all came out. And so he wrote the second book, a little bit smaller, quite a bit smaller, I should say. And he used that as like a compendium to understand his previous work. And he kind of changed a few things, updated some things to try to explain things better, because people criticized, especially the Treatise of Human Nature, 1739. So he put it into a compendium. He summarized things. He explained things better. And he said, please use this book to understand my views better than my older book. I was a little bit naive and young when I wrote the first book, and he wasn't very old, of course, in his 20s. But he was very, at least from I guess we could call him a precocious young man. So he was able to write many things, and his impact has been incredible. And so we're going to spend most of our time talking about the inquiry, because he asked us to. He said, I mean, I've used both books and I read both books, and I think you need to understand and read the first book first before you tackle the second book. And the second book reads like a, kind of like a repetition. It helps you remind you of his previous ideas, but you see it's a little bit more clear. You can see it's more summarized better. So we're going to spend more time talking about his second book. And what he wants to do, here's his program. He wants to use empirical reason based on raw experience to critique transcendence. That's the point. In fact, he wants to get rid of all transcendental reason, because in his mind, this is a superstition. It's the old Catholic stuff, even the old pagan stuff. He wants to sort of set that stuff aside. We need to focus strictly on this world science and observation and experience. And that was his whole point. He wants to get rid of medieval metaphysics. So let's talk about his biography. Who is he? History. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was educated when he was very young in the classics under Scottish Calvinism. And of course, see, he received the classical education very young, but he received it through the Scottish Calvinism. So his ideas against paganism, against superstition, and of course the Catholic Church has a problem too, even though in Scottish Calvinism would have actually done a pretty good job getting rid of most of that superstition. Of course, still there were Catholic churches, many in Scotland at that time anyway. Of course, you had all kinds of back and forth pulling and pushing, and of course the 30 Years' War was maybe 100 years from back in Europe, tore up Europe. And so we have many things still going on between Catholicism and Protestantism. And yet we're going to see some things later on with regard to Hume's view on cause and effect that I really think are probably rooted. His rejection of cause and effect, he didn't reject it exactly, but he compounded it. He made it complex. He made it sort of a little bit difficult to understand. I still don't really understand his view on cause and effect, because I don't think it makes any sense. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but he wants to sully cause and effect. We could say that at least. He wants to minimize it to some extent. And the reason why is because I think he's worried about Calvinistic predestination. So he wants to try to calm down the predestination, almost like a fatalism. So he's going to, his idea to lessen that problem, let's go after cause and effect. And if we can sully that, then we can, we can sort of calm down the hyper Calvinism that was taught in his day. As a young man, he moved to a small town in France. Interesting. So after his classical studies, probably late teenager, he goes to France, and he actually studies at the Jesuit college where Descartes was. So he was there. I mean, he wasn't nothing official, but he was there in terms of spending time there. He would go back and forth with the college there. He got to know different folks. And of course, the Jesuits are generally pretty, even back then, were a little bit progressive, in certain categories, certain areas. So he would have, of course, he jostled with them as well. And so a lot of these things we see his experience now in France, and the Catholicism, the Jesuit culture, but also the French Enlightenment is also stirring behind the scenes. And so he's growing up in the background of what's happening in Europe at this time. Probably at this time, but I think it's probably even younger, he becomes a lifelong antagonist against organized religion, and especially against miracles. He's tired of miracles. And, I think that Christians need to pay attention here, because, he heard so many superstitious things, he lost all respect even for biblical miracles. And I think even today, in many churches, everything's a miracle. And I think we miss the point of miracles if this is really the case. Even in the Bible, by the way, we don't see that many miracles. I mean, we have certain times, like the Exodus. We see lots of miracles. We see, of course, the conquest, lots of miracles, but that's like they come in couples, lots of miracles. And then, things are kind of quiet after that, relatively speaking, not totally, but relatively speaking. Then we see lots of miracles with Elijah and Elisha. That's like, in between, halfway between the coming of Christ and also with the Exodus and what happened in Egypt, all the miracles that God used to destroy Egypt. And then, of course, we have the time of Jesus and the apostles. Again, lots of miracles. In between those times, miracles are sort of there once in a while, but not all the time. See, and if that's true in the Bible, you need to kind of think about some things today. If you have a miracle going every week in your church, and it also takes away from the great meaning of the miracles. Okay, in the Bible, when you look at miracles, miracles have great meaning, and we have forgotten this because we're so preoccupied with. Of course, we have followed a lot of our philosophy today, and again, Hume has had a big reason why we have empty thoughts today, and we're not thinking about what these things mean. In the Bible, miracles mean a lot. And of course, primarily, especially with Jesus and the Acts, the book of Acts, the apostles we're talking about, it teaches salvation by grace. It illustrates that. And so when you understand these miracles and what they meant, then you have God is using the truth, and he uses miracles to support the truth. And this is the biblical view. And so there's great meaning with miracles. We've kind of forgotten that. For example, when Jesus looks at the paralytic, he says, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And boy, that teaches salvation by grace. It also teaches that he has the authority to forgive sins. And then Jesus proved it, that he is God, because only God can forgive sins. And of course, the Pharisees were discussing this. They were arguing about this. Religious leaders that saw this take place, only God forgives sins. They were thinking in their minds. And Jesus says, yes, precisely. And so, my son, your sins are forgiven. Of course, Jesus proved that he forgave his sins because the guy was immediately healed. So Jesus showed to them that he is God manifest in the flesh, and he also showed that we're saved by grace, by God's declaration, his judicial declaration, of course, justification by faith, and that was illustrated by the miracle. And you have to really stop and think about these miracles a little bit better. And a lot of Christians aren't doing that. We need to do that more. This would help keep people like David Hume at bay a little bit and slow them down a little bit, because too many people they just stop listening when you start talking about miracles. And this is too bad, because we have lost lots of battles in this particular realm. And David Hume just rejected all miracles. He threw all the baby out with the bathwater. And that's kind of where the empirical view of the world went. Notice here, we already talked about his two books here, 1739, the first one, Treatise of Human Nature, 1748, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Of course, it's very related to empiricism, experience. That's the point. He wants to emphasize knowledge from experience. Both books are very controversial. So he was not able to get a teaching post, although he tried. So he becomes a diplomat of sorts. And in between, he actually was a diplomat on both ends. And in between, he worked for a law school at a library. And while he was there at the library, it was at a law school, and he looked into all of the references that were there, the resources that were there. And he decided, I'm going to write a book on the history of England, because all of the materials were there, and he did. And that was a 6-volume set on the history of England. That became a bestseller. And this is what made Hume famous, was his writing of history. And so then later, when they looked at his history books, they loved what he said. Then he sort of, his philosophy, they started to take more seriously. People started to talk about him. He became more widely known, and of course, translated to different languages. Immanuel Kant read Hume, and he's going to use Hume a lot in his books. I read Immanuel Kant last year, Critique of Pure Reason. I also read his Prolegomena, and I was shocked when I read Hume how much Kant borrowed from Hume. It's interesting to me that he freely borrows from Hume all the time, and he didn't quote it. Interesting. I guess we become more strict on that with our modern academic standards today. But boy, he borrowed all kinds of things from Hume, and he did recognize it. Hume woke me up from my dogmatic slumber, as he always famously said. But still, I was surprised how much Kant had used Hume. So Hume is really an important person in developing our modern Western culture on what we call empiricism. And Kant, of course, is going to be also very important. That's another book, another topic, which I discussed last year in our course here. Hume was a Tory, so he was conservative politically. Interesting, however, he probably a pretty liberal Tory because he supported the American Revolution. So he appropriately died in 1776, just as the American independence was just began. And so I think very interesting. Hume was not against the American Revolution. He was also a friend of Adam Smith, and of course he was the economist of the day. Of course, capitalism and money, and the wealth of nations, and his famous books and influence on economic theory and things of that nature. Interesting, however, is that Hume will have a falling out with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So they did not get along. Actually, Hume brought him to England, and then they had some problems, and they split. So very interesting that did not work, although they were, in many ways, their philosophy was not that much different. I'm sorry, I got a phone call, and I need to had to stop that call, so I'm sorry. So let's take a look at our next slide here. Let's go on down, and here we have a map, the British Empire when David Hume lived. Okay, so the British Empire is becoming very powerful. This is probably, in my opinion, it could be wrong, I think this really represents a climax of Britain's power. And so they are now in charge of the world. Of course, they run the seas, and they're having all kinds of things all over the world. Colonialism is everywhere. And of course, when Hume writes his book, he's writing it from a progressive point of view. And he's showing, look where England is now sitting. And I'm sure he gave credit to his own emphasis on science, the growth of science and empiricism, as people become more rooted in the world we live in. They're becoming smarter and better with the things that they have learned from nature by excluding all this superstitious stuff that Europe had plunged, the Catholic Church had plunged Europe into for centuries. So let's take a look at our notes now. Let's summarize some things. And I want you to fill in the notes here. Let's take a look at Roman numeral 1, just to refresh our memory. Here we have the fill-in term. I want you to fill in Hume. So the Scottish philosopher David Hume quietly laid the philosophical foundations for Western modernism and postmodernism in the 1700s. We will see that not only was Hume an empiricist, but see, in his emphasis of empiricism, he emphasized empiricism so strongly that at the end of the day, everything is rooted in is experience. Everything is experiential. So when you start doing that, okay, what happens? Empiricism becomes existential. It becomes rooted in our own existential world. And now the existence of the world around us existentially understood, not by my rational categories, which Hume has excised. He's removed them out. Now existentialism, my existentialist thoughts, are now at the heart of what I know to be true. So what happens is that empiricism, if you take it too seriously and become too strict, we can talk about strict Calvinism. Well, he's going to go strict empiricism. And at the end of the day, he's going to create a lot of doubts. And of course, his own agnostic mind helps to create this problem. So Hume's own philosophy not only led to empiricism with regard to what we call the scientific revolution, and of course, logical positivism that grew out of that. And we're only going to look at the scientific facts, and that's it, supposedly. Kind of almost like a fundamentalism of science, the looking at strictly the material world. Then you have, on the other hand, this postmodernism. And today we have the same problem. We have this logical positivism and science, all with this fundamentalism with materialism. And then wrapped around it, we have this postmodernism. And then you put those things together, and it's just dynamite. And people, they don't even know what's going on anymore. And the scientific revolution has lost its way, and in many ways because of this existentialism. And David Hume is at the heart of this discussion. I suspected this over the years, not Hume per se. I did not realize until I read his books. But in my studies of the past, I was looking at what's going on with empiricism. Why do I always see these existential views? And not just existentialism, but even before that, romanticism. Why am I seeing these romantic views? And we're going to discuss how this actually is the case. And Hume is he's also very romantic as well. We'll talk about his emphasis on feelings. So if you plunge into experience alone, okay, you're going to plunge yourself into the whole of life alone without transcendence. That gets you caught up not just with man's thinking abilities, but also his customs, his habits, his feelings, his emotions, all those things. And what happens is that empiricism actually gets downgraded into a level of passions and emotions rather than what we have normally understood to be true scientific facts. In fact, Hume will actually say that the true facts are basically rooted around passions and my emotions. Number one, Hume's original family was home. That was what he was originally called, the family name, which Hume himself later changed. Hume was born, that's the fill-in term, 1711. 3, Hume was raised under strict Scottish Calvinism, bequeathed to Scotland from Calvin's Geneva through John Knox's ministry. And of course, John Knox went to Geneva and listened to John Calvin teach in Geneva. And Geneva, of course, Switzerland was a free country. And so they're able to do, even though it's problematic there too, but they're able to do some good teaching there in Geneva. And so what's going to happen, John Knox will take that teaching from Geneva and he will root it into Scotland. Scotland, by the way, was more conservative, their Enlightenment than, we will see this as well, than the English Enlightenment. Interesting. So Hume was a little bit of a rebel. The Scottish Enlightenment was actually pretty good. I mean, they did a pretty good job rooting reason into faith. And so it's not as rebellious as it was in England. It's not as rebellious. Of course, it was really rebellious later on in Germany. Number 4, Hume lived through the time of the conservative Scottish Enlightenment, which was far less rebellious against the scriptures. Number 5, Hume was greatly influenced by the empirical work of Englishmen Lord Bacon and John Locke of the previous centuries. We'll take a look at those men briefly here shortly. Number 6, although Hume was a conservative Tory in favor of constitutional monarchy, which allowed much liberty under its auspices, he was a supporter of American independence. And then number 7, Hume died in 1776. So number 6, Hume was a Tory. Number 5, the empirical work. So that's the fill-in term. Number 4, less. They were far less rebellious. And of course, number 3, strict Scottish Calvinism. And then number 2, born. He was born in 1711. His original family name was Home. That's the fill-in term there. So let's take a look at some of our slides. Let's continue our lecture on David Hume and his philosophy. Now, to understand, how we go from this medieval rationalism and science, where they viewed God made a rational world, and therefore I'm going to study nature because God made it, and I'm going to study the laws of nature. This will help me understand how God did things. This was the original desire in the scientific revolution. So we have to understand something of what happened in those days. And just for example, even many scientists later on, Alfred North Whitehead, for example, he said, and he just died, recently. I mean, compared to Hume, we could say, of course, maybe 100 years ago now, but 75 years ago, faith in the possibility of science is an unconscious derivative from medieval theology. And we don't think about this, but this is true. This is part of the problem why I have the empiricism has run off the rails, because okay, if science was started by people who believe that, how can you remove all transcendence from this and still consider yourself to be a scientist? I don't understand this, because what you do and what Hume has done and what many empiricists have done, and even Darwin himself, who also followed Hume very closely, basically you make yourself into an animal. You're no longer made in God's image. And I don't understand how a scientist animal can be a scientist. That doesn't make sense to me. You have undercut the whole scientific revolution at its foundations, because the world that God made was intelligently designed. And the reason why I can learn something from nature is precisely because God intelligently designed it. This is the whole point of why scientists originally wanted to study nature, because they knew they were going to learn something from it, because God designed it that way. He designed it to be intelligently done so we could put these things together. Now that's gone. Nature is not made by an all-wise God. In fact, what exactly is nature teaching me today is kind of a problem, as I understand this. So this is really strange to me, but of course, a lot of strange things are going on today, again, because we have this empiricism wrapped up or maybe enveloped by existentialism, postmodernism, where people don't believe in any truth anymore. So the scientific revolution has sort of lost its way, and Hume is really the bridge that did that. And he got away from these things. Notice even Ernst Mach, he was German, he said this: every unbiased mind must admit that the age in which the chief development of science of mechanics took place was an age of predominantly theological cast. And if you look at the history of this is very clear. Christians were the original scientists. God, made man in his image, and God commanded Adam and Eve to rule over the planet. And of course, the scientific revolution, knowledge is power. They were going to rule, dominion mandate. The scientific revolution, that's part of his dominion. That's part of the dominion mandate. That's what, they're doing what God commanded them to do. Of course, they're doing it with wrong motives. They're doing it with wrong reasons because they don't have a biblical worldview, or sort of kind of mixed in with paganism. So this was always a problem. But the importance by itself, being a scientist, you use it to rule over nature. And this by itself is not wrong. The question is how you do it, and then the wisdom that's required to do it. That's another story. And of course, we don't have either anymore. But by itself, there's nothing wrong with rule over nature. This is part of our original divine mandate that God gave to us. So at the very beginning, scientists used to study the laws of nature. Of course, the math was very important to them, mathematics, and so they talked about the dimensions of the solar system, the sun, the earth, and all the things, the geography of the earth, the planet, the oceans, study of the geography, the climatography based on the geography, of course, where different places are. And of course, this will also set up their whole exploration. As they explored the world, they got out from Europe, and so they had a very broad view of the world now as they expanded their horizons at the world in which we lived in. So all these things were very important, but they weren't godless at the beginning. Notice even Isaac Newton later performed his scientific studies for the glory of God. Another thing that we've always forgotten is that when Galileo was placed under pressures, this was not against the biblical view of the world. The Bible does not teach, that the earth is the center of the universe. The Bible never teaches that. But Aristotle did. And the Catholics came along when they recovered Aristotle, and they used his categories to systematize their understanding of the world, including the natural world. Aristotle was one who said the earth was the center of the universe. And so they just dressed up Aristotle's cosmology in Christian terms. And then we get blamed for this, even though they should have never done that. They took Aristotle too seriously. So when Copernicus and these men, Kepler and Galileo, started to look at things and say, no, this doesn't quite make sense. The math is not here for this. And they finally realized, you know what? The sun is at the center, and we revolve around the sun. And really, biblically, okay, the son of God. Remember, he's called the son of righteousness, I believe, in the book of Malachi. So this is not inconsistent with biblical cosmology. And so everything revolves around the sun. And of course, everything revolves around the Son of God. Interesting, Erasmus, he was a medieval humanist. And, he talks about why science of his day, even in those days, he said, look at the old Greek, this idea that the Greeks were these super scientists, this is not true. Christians started science. Why? Because they got rid of the pantheistic view of the world. See, if God is if God is very pagan, he's very pantheistic, and God's a part of nature, and he's all mixed up in nature, you're not going to study nature because it's like studying God. It's too sacrilegious. And that's something Erasmus pointed out. It was only after people realized, when they became Christians, and over time they began to think about the world differently, as they look at God made the world, and God is separate from that world. He's transcendent above it. So we can study this world. In fact, it's part of the original dominion mandate that God, he intelligently designed the world to teach us. So they started to understand these things, and they started to realize that, we can study some of these things, and this is not sacrilegious by itself. Plato, he even talked about theory is more important to him than experience, than even what you would call experimentation. So this idea that the Greeks were scientists, I mean, they had some ideas about math and, here and there, but the scientific revolution really did not begin until the Middle Ages. And really what spurred it on, one of the primary inventions was that the monks wanted to get up in the morning. It's dark up in the north. And so they invented a clock so they could get up early in the morning to do their prayers. And that will start the mechanics. And of course, this happened, Aristotle, and, the idea of reason is important. Of course, they used faith to interpret reason in those days. So that, faith was primary, reason was secondary. And so reason is going to actually serve faith. Hume, very interesting. He wanted to use reason to serve the passions. Something's gone wrong here. So we'll talk about this a little bit later. Francis Bacon, very important. He's the man who coined the term knowledge is power. And he's going to he's going to start the scientific revolution. Why? Through observation. This is called the inductive theory. We're going to inductively study nature by observation to determine whether or not these things are actually so. And then we're going to develop those theories into practice, and we're going to develop mechanics, and those mechanics will give us power. So this was the original scientific revolution. Lord Bacon was the original progenitor of this, the theorist of this. And he was also a strong Christian. He, as far as we know, I mean, he apparently had some lapses here and there, but he had a Christian worldview, certainly. And he was never critical. He never saw anything inconsistent with his study of science, and also the study of the natural world around him and the study of the scriptures. So at the beginning, again, they were not atheistic or agnostic like they were with Hume. Now, what is rationalism? So before Hume, okay, we have rationalism. So why don't we talk about what is it? Rationalism in Western philosophy is the view that regards reason as the chief source and test of knowledge. And it doesn't matter. See, your experience really is not that important. It's what you think, thinking apart from the world you live in, and thinking apart from experience. Of course, Kant and Hume called it a priori reasoning. And so that was the primary way of knowing the truth, is through reason. Holding that reality itself has an inherently logical structure. That's part of, God made the world rationally. And so there's a relationship between my mind and the world that God made. And I can understand the world that God made because there's a consistency between God made me, my mind, God teaches me through nature, and these things are working together. That's what they originally thought. And this is part of the rationalistic transcendence that they presumed up until the time of Hume. They started to question it a little bit before Hume, but Hume is really the primary figure that sort of does away with all that. So notice here has an inherently logical structure. The rationalists assert that a class of truths exists that the intellect can grasp directly. There are, according to the rationalists, certain rationalist principles, especially in logic and mathematics, and even in ethics and metaphysics. See, there's that rationalism deals with both this world and the transcendent world. And reason goes back and forth between both of them. That was the original mix that created the scientific revolution. And we're not getting credit for this. Transcendence, really, if you really want progress, you have to have some sense of transcendence. Otherwise, you cannot have progress. So scientific progress was born in a transcendent worldview. We've forgotten this. And this is sort of a contradiction in our modern view of the world. Everybody believes in progress, but boy, the idea of progress is something taught in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. We've forgotten all these things, and now why are we progressing? And then you mix that up with postmodernism, and this is dynamite again. It's very dangerous. Notice the rationalist confidence in reason and proof tends, therefore, to detract from their respect for other ways of knowing. So they're going to use their reason. They trusted their reason, by the way, which is a problem. We are not to trust our own minds. So they started to worship reason, and that's a problem. Okay, you worship reason, that's not good. Again, originally, reason was to serve faith. Okay, but now, as time goes on, they're starting to trust they're learning to see the learning things now. God is teaching them through the world they made in. Oh wow, there's lots of good things here. Then they started, God was blessing them, but like always, blessing leads to pride. And they started to worship their reason. So there's going to be a backlash against the worship of reason. That's going to be empiricism coming up. But notice the second point, rationalism has long been the rival of empiricism, the doctrine that all knowledge comes from and must be tested by sense and experience. So you can believe many rational things logically without a problem. It may make perfect logical sense, but is it real? That's a different question. See, and so the empiricist says, look at guys, so you can't just sit there and have a logical argument about some abstraction that may be logically consistent, but it represents nothing that's real. There's a truth in there, and that needs to be taken seriously too. Remember, God uses history to reveal himself. It's not pure abstraction. Jesus became a man. Okay, he became, human flesh. The truth is a person, and God became the God-man in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. We know this. The Word became flesh, as it says in John chapter 1. So the Word is not pure abstraction. See, I mean, so again, the Bible has a lot more balance between rationalism, transcendence, and empiricism. We don't get credit for this. We should. And I think we need to get back to the Bible, and that's my personal opinion on these things. It would help us in a lot of different ways. Notice, as against this doctrine, rationalism holds to reason to be a faculty that can lay hold of truths beyond the reach of sense perception. Okay, there's a problem there. God reveals himself historically, and then we know through that touching of the real world. Through that, yes, we can know transcendent realities because God revealed himself. But for you and I to start from ourselves without the Bible, okay, and then start to think about, the world that I want to dream up logically from a rational point of view, that's a problem. And a lot of philosophers did that. Plato did that. He imagined, he looks at the world we live in and he's thinking, well, there obviously has to be something transcendent. Most people presume that. It's only been the last couple hundred years that people have begun to doubt that. Most people have presumed it. So what he thought is that, okay, we have all these things in the world I live in. There must be some transcendental forms that this world reflects. And that's kind of a strange view that, okay, we look at the world and, okay, I look at a tree. I'm looking at a tree right now outside my window, and then in heaven somehow, or in the transcendent worldly metaphysical beyond, there's some kind of a general tree and this tree reflects that general tree that actually has a real existence up there. Strange, but this is what, they're trying to wrestle with things. They knew transcendent was real, but what is it? What am I looking at? Where does it come from? So that was Plato's view. Augustine, I think he was pretty smart. He said, look at those Platonic forms don't really exist. Like, a Platonic form of a tree does not exist in the metaphysical world at all. No, these things exist in the mind of God. So there is an abstraction, God's mind, but God has revealed himself through nature, through what he has made, but also through history, especially the Bible. So if you start from yourself, yes, you're going to have some problems. You're going to be like maybe Plato, and that's an abstraction. Are those things really real? Well, we don't know. See, Hume has some good arguments against that kind of stuff. And this is why we got this back and forth going on. Okay, what is empiricism? Empiricism in philosophy is a view that all concepts originate in experience, that all concepts are about or applicable to things that can be experienced, or that all rationally accepted beliefs or propositions are justifiable or knowable only through experience. This broad definition accords with the derivation of the term empiricism from the ancient Greek word empiria, which means experience. And then concepts are said to be a posteriori. Of course, in rationalism, I can't pronounce that either. A priori, a posteriori. That's in the opposite. A posteriori means all based on experience. A priori means it's based on reason alone, apart from experience. So if they can be applied only on the basis of experience, see, that's, comes after the fact. That's sort of the point. And they are called, of course, the other rationalism is based on a priori reasoning. So a priori reasoning is apart from experience. A posteriori experience, that means after experience. And of course, this will set the groundwork for what we call existentialism, because in existentialism, existence precedes reason. Existence precedes rationalism. Existence precedes essence. And Hume's going to be emphasizing this. We will see this as we go on. So if you take experience that seriously, what's going to happen is that experience will dominate everything. That's a problem. Kant realized we can't go that way too, so he tried to fix Hume, even though he borrowed Hume a lot. he tried to fix Hume in certain areas and tried to, we'll talk a little bit about that later. We don't have too much time to develop, but very interesting. Notice beliefs or propositions are said to be a posteriori if they are knowable only on the basis of experience, and a priori if they are knowable independently of experience. Of course, Hume says you can't know anything outside of experience. Kant believed the same thing, by the way. Thus, according to the second and third definitions of empiricism above, empiricism is the view that all concepts or all rationally acceptable beliefs or propositions are a posteriori rather than a priori. Of course, they would say, you're okay, you want to believe faith, that's fine, and that's sort of a priori, that's fine, but we don't know anything about it, and we're not going to spend much time with it. So notice the different combatants, rationalism versus empiricism. Rationalists, of course, Descartes. John Locke, empiricist. But again, John Locke lived at the same time as Francis Bacon, Lord Bacon. He has a very similar view of the world as Francis Bacon. He has Judeo-Christian values, as you know, is helping him understand the world in which he lives in. So I don't have a problem with John Locke. Hume is going to, he's going to set aside both Descartes and John Locke, even though he learned a lot from John Locke. So that they keep on, correcting each other, and they become more radical as time goes on, and they reject, people sit there and criticize Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and I understand some of the problems here and the subjectivism of all that, but at least he came back to square one, and he had you can sit there and debate his argument wasn't that good, but I'm thankful that he realized that God still existed. He used the ontological argument of God's existence, borrowed from Anselm. That should be respected regardless, in spite of some of his subjectivity about the truth. Okay, he still believed in objective truth, that God actually existed, and so did John Locke. So the original back and forth between rationalism and empiricism was not as strong as it became after Hume. So notice here, Descartes, he thought reason could explain the working of the world without reference to sense experience. I think, therefore I am. That sort of says, I live in, it's all in my mind here, and then I'll figure this out. Okay. Conversely, John Locke's empiricism argued the mind was like a blank slate. So the mind is, there's nothing there. You may have, Kant will call this later on categories of the mind. They are there. And then, of course, nature comes in with the information, the sense experience will teach me. So that was Kant's view, which was informed by the world of experience. And, Kant and both Kant and Hume are going to believe that too, but they're going to get rid of all transcendence, because John Locke, I think, is a much better, more rounded even than Descartes. John Locke understood that God made the world, and that God made a rational world, and that God is teaching me through the world which he made. And so I can learn from God through nature as well. I mean, this is basically John Locke's position. And so he assumes transcendence. Kant rejected Locke's empiricism, arguing that rational mind is incapable of structuring and interpreting sense experience. That's another story. Of course, Hume, very similar. Medieval rationalism, natural theology was converted into empirical naturalism in 1600 to 1700. So when you look at men like Descartes and Locke and Lord Bacon and the Christian medieval scientists, they started out with sort of a medieval rationalism theology, and these things are in a maybe a pretty good mix. Maybe initially reason was serving faith, but as time goes on, they start to they're starting now to use reason to actually faith is going to become less important to them, but still they were mixed together to some extent. Then we have empiricism, and what happens now? We have the birth of naturalism. So we go from natural laws which God made and rationally designed, that we see in the natural world we live in, and then those natural laws under deism become almost deified, because now those laws cannot be broken. Newton's gravitational laws, for example. So then they started to teach that. And then they said, well, there can't be numericals, therefore. Well, I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Look at the God who made the world. If he made these laws, I mean, certainly if he made the laws, he can break them if he wants to. I mean, of course, people break laws all the time in our own experience every day, right? I mean, this goes on. So this is strange stuff that goes on, but this is what people's unbelief, toward God. People can't think precisely. They can't think good when it comes to God. They lose their minds a little bit. So they started to deny miracles. And then this will now slide into naturalism, which is what Hume is going to emphasize. And then Hume emphasized naturalism so much that he's going to devolve into existentialism, romanticism, postmodernism. So the Age of Enlightenment, again, they worship reason. This is what we've normally understood to be the case. I'm a little bit, it's almost self-serving, the people that emphasize empiricism, we are the smartest people. Yet when you look clearly at what Kant actually said, what is enlightenment? He doesn't say that enlightenment is a matter of improving our knowledge. Of course, improving our knowledge of this world, yes, and Hume would strongly agree. But he denied a lot of knowledge in order to focus on those worldly things, to know them. In the process, a lot of things were dumbed down. Science is reductionistic, and it became especially reductionistic through empiricism because they rooted out all the metaphysical stuff. And they just wanted to focus on this world. And so actually you're reducing knowledge. Kant actually said, I am denying knowledge in order to make room for faith. He's denying knowledge. Okay. So on the one hand, science is supposed to be super smart, but on the other hand, we're denying knowledge. That's a contradiction. And then Kant also said, the Enlightenment is this: it is the courage to use your own reason. Courage. It's about courage. It's not about more knowledge. It's about courage. That's different. And Hume would say that without any problem. In fact, he said basically, reason is designed to serve your passions, to serve your emotions. That's what Hume saw. So there's a devaluation of reason. See, reason cannot deal with transcendental issues. Reason is so stupid that it cannot deal with transcendental issues. That's basically their viewpoint. So I'm a little skeptical of what they call the Enlightenment. I think that the Enlightenment with Hume and Kant is a counter-enlightenment. They are okay. Yes, people are worshiping reason. That's a problem. But now they're going to start worshiping themselves. Worship our passions. Hume. Kant called it the transcendental idealism. Basically, called it self-sufficient reason, which is intellectual autarky, dependent on myself. And yet, of course, my own experience of the world. So depending on my own view and, of course, the experiences that I have without any transcendence, which I can't know. So he denied a lot of that transcendental knowledge that many people took for granted for centuries. Now all of that is gone. And now we focus on this world and let's do some mathematics. Let's crunch the numbers. And now we have all these technological gadgets today, and we have a lot of foolish people today because they're not thinking transcendentally. They've lost reasoning capacities to think transcendentally beyond themselves. And Kant and Hume are at the heart of this problem. The Enlightenment, I think, is the counter-enlightenment against truth and reason. And now we're suffering greatly. And then what I've seen this last year, we've lost our minds, especially with regard to a lot of things happening politically in our world today. Now, Solomon would agree with some of this. Again, you start from yourself. He says, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast ascends downward to the earth? Of course, Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes probably at a difficult time in his life. Maybe during the time or after, when he finally recovered, he was worshiping idols for a time toward the end of his life. He tried to bring in the kingdom this side of the grave. And of course, we live in a fallen world. And so then he said, it's all in vanity. The guy that's going to take over my kingdom is nothing compared to who I was. So he's, that this is always a problem. You hand over churches to a lesser guy. Okay. You hand over your inheritance to somebody else and he's not as good as you. And then Solomon, why did I do all this? Interesting. 6:9 Ecclesiastes, what the eye see is better than what the soul desires. This too is futility and striving after wind. So, our mind is full of all kinds of imaginations. And this is exactly what Hume and Kant were talking about. We have all these wild imaginations that have nothing to do with reality. Yeah, interesting point. And biblically, the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament is against pagan superstition. It's against pagan mysticism. And Israel's entire history was wrestling with those types of things. Notice Ecclesiastes 8:1. Who is the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illumines him and causes his stern face to beam. So let's go back to our notes again. Take a look at B, and let's take a look at our student notes, and notice number B. David Hume was a lifelong antagonist against what he considered to be the superstition of all organized religion. Number 1, he anonymously wrote a treatise of human reason, which was published in 1739, which attempted to generally explain the whole of human experience based on strict empiricism without any intrusion of transcendence. 1739 is the fill-in term. 2, after being subjected to criticism, Hume polished and updated his work in 1748 with a compendium entitled An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And then number 3, Hume was particularly critical of medieval rationalism, where theology reigned as the queen of the sciences for centuries. So Kant did too, but Hume and Kant are going to get rid of the queen, and we're going to have empiricism only. Number 4, this was, Kant was a little bit more conservative, but he, I'm sure, believed very similar, just didn't talk about it so much. Number 4, Hume strongly denounced belief in miracles as contrary to the natural laws of human experience. Well, of course, they're contrary to human experience. That's saying the obvious. Number 5, Hume's social ethics, politics, economic philosophy excised all metaphysics, so that convention and custom based on evolutionary experiences is the driving force of all human activity. Number 6, Hume's agnosticism prevented him from becoming a professor at any university. Number 7, in between the diplomatic posts in Europe, Hume was a librarian at Edinburgh's Law School. Number 8, Hume used the library sources to write a 6-volume series on the history of England, became a bestseller. B, Hume's works thus became more widely known and accepted. And C, Immanuel Kant based much of his own transcendental idealism on Hume's philosophy, which later laid the bedrock for positivism. Of course, the science, the empiricism, only the facts, only the so-called scientific facts of observation, experimentation, modernism, postmodernism, with many romantic and existential twists along the way, which we will see as we go on to our study. So here we have a little bit of introduction to Hume, and we're halfway through our lecture. So we'll talk about a few of the points here of his empiricism. We'll make a few quotes here and there from his books here and there, but primarily we won't spend a whole lot of time because it just gets to be bogged down with too many details, but we'll give the general principles. But notice here, what's his program? Well, what's he trying to accomplish? Well, we've already alluded to a little bit, but notice here, Hume's dream, and not just him, but many people, including Kant, shared by others, was to replace the appeal to forms of rationalism as a means of distinguishing true from false beliefs with the development of a science of human nature. So we need to look at who is the human being. He's no longer made per se in God's image. We don't know that anymore. Let's look at him strictly from an experiential point of view. Let's look at the flesh, basically. Man is fallen. By the way, I've got all kinds of quotes that Hume recognized man is fallen. Okay, so how are you going to use a fallen world, empirically understood, experientially understood, to get at the truth? Explain this to me. And yet your own work realizes that we live in a fallen world. I don't understand how we're going to see. We have to have some sense of transcendence. The original scientists they believed in transcendence. Let's go back to that. I think what's going on, intelligent design folks are doing a lot of tremendous work right now. They're learning lots of good stuff right now. Let's open up the discussion here. Let's learn some things. The second point, he thus tried to cut out, Hume did, all forms of medieval rationalism and natural theology in order to allegedly draw a strictly empirical portrait of human nature based upon the raw experience of scientific experimentation. Well, now we become a human experiment. You think about that. It's a problem. And of course, I could talk about a lot of things, what happened under National Socialism in the 1940s. In order to have a thoroughgoing empiricism, Hume decided to excise all forms of a priori reasoning, particularly those that dealt with rationalistic cause and effect, since it was too much based in metaphysics. If you look at the original cause and effect reasoning, it's based on God made the world. Okay, God originally made the world, and so there's an effect. Okay, God is the cause, and we see all the effects. And so this is why Hume said we got to get rid of that. The problem is when you get rid of cause and effect like that, you sully it a little bit. This creates problems now with regard to your understanding of reasoning, how these things fit together. We'll talk about this. Very interesting. Hume did not do away with cause and effect. He realized it's true, but said it was only based on interpreted experience. It's a matter of instinct. See, it's not transcendental. It doesn't come from God. Cause and effect is instinct. You don't even have to think about it. You just observe it, and that's it. Not necessarily. It's almost pure existentialism here. Don't think about it. You can't. It's a matter of custom. It's not a matter of reason. So cause and effect is a matter of instinct, and it's a matter of custom, experience. Don't think about it because you can't. And of course, the reason why is because they think that way is because cause and effect arguments were all given to them by all these rationalistic philosophers who believed in God, and they believed in the scriptures. They believed that God made the world. See, so that's why they're against this. We look at this, well, how can they be doing that? Well, they're trying to push back against all of their theological and philosophical buddies that seem to be talking about things that aren't related to this world. And that's the point. And so Hume says, look, cause and effect is just strictly, it's a matter of instinct. You can't prove it rationally. If you could, it'd be like an argument from transcendence. You have to use an argument from transcendence to prove it. So this is the whole point. This is what's going on here. Such empiricism was first investigated philosophically, but then later extended generally to try and encapsulate all of life. So now it becomes existential, a holism, all of life, your emotions, your will, politics, social society, socialism, all these things so now we're gonna study everything, the human being especially. So the early scientists, they were studying the natural world. God made it, dominion, the world, the natural world. Now it's more about studying the human being. They're going to try to take that same scientific worldview and basically start using this to understand people. But again, people are more than just a material bunch of pieces together that came together by chance and by time. And basically, the scientists have turned us into a big experiment. There's a lot that could be said here. I don't have time to develop it, but I just, all this stuff, they have, and this is why we're being experimented upon, is because we're no longer transcendent. We don't treat people with respect because we don't believe in transcendence. We're just animals. So now we're just treating each other like experimental animals. And the most graphic logical conclusion of where that all heads to is what happened with the Holocaust, when you have the Nazis actually physically doing real scientific doctor experiments on people physically. But basically, the human nature, society, politics, this is all like an experiment, a big experiment with what people are and what they do. Empiricism thus began to sink into the realms of what I call romanticism, vitalism, and existentialism, because it deals with what? Things like habit, custom, convention, how you feel about it all. What is your will today? Those kinds of things. And those are all not rational per se. And of course, that's the problem. So if you look at Hume's motivations, his empiricism here, notice the romantic things you see going on here now. So he has rejected transcendence. Notice all knowledge begins with impressions. Impressions. Wow. So knowledge has been reduced to impressions. Say they come from me from the outside. There's some impression that I have. Notice this, of course, it's all sensory. Our minds are just like copy machines. So we kind of look at the world and we just make a copy, and that impression, we copy it and copy it. So later on, of course, we developed the copy machines to help us remember. Notice that people lacking either a sensory modality or impressions cannot form ideas of these things. So ideas come from the impressions that that hit us. And sometimes, when he talks about impressions, it's like when you read it, it's like these impressions almost hit you. See, that you feel it. Some are violent, he says. Notice impressions enter with the most force, and violence are more vivacious than ideas. So he's telling, some of these impressions are very violent. And I'm thinking he doesn't like metaphysics. I think that's what he I don't know that for sure, but I think that's what he's talking about. There's opposition coming from God. The heavens declare the glory of God. Anyway, some things to think about here. It's romantic. It's how you feel. See, the impressions hit my mind. They hit me in some way. By the way, there's a truth in this. You look at Proverbs, so you look at Solomon, you look at even Psalm 119, where the human body, of course, is made in God's image. And, that those human body parts, are to be used by the word of God. And, our body is made in God's image, but they kind of want to get rid of the image. And so they focus exclusively on the flesh. And the word of God, okay, that will protect us from working on the flesh. So I use the word of God to help my eyes, to read, to see, to walk straight ahead. I used my ears to listen to God's word. Right? I use my mouth, to speak the word of God that I put into my heart, as it says. So again, we could spend a lot of time with this. We don't have the time, but again, they're trying to get rid of all those transcendental things. And basically what we're left with is the flesh, the fallen man. And that's going to become the basis for truth, whatever that is. Here's Hume's famous fork. So he's going to basically create a fork between modernism and postmodernism. So, and really, Hume's primary project was postmodernism. Math was exciting to him, but not that exciting. He was more interested in to experience the passions and using reason to serve the passions. So most things, impressions are very important to Hume, all taken through experience. And of course, these are his so-called matters of fact, but those matters of fact have been, cause and effect have been rooted out from that. The idea of classical cause and effect. So this kind of muddies the waters for knowledge of those things. And not only with regard to nature, but also to history too. And of course, this is going to be part of the reason why he doesn't believe in biblical history either. It's part of the same argument. So in the process of getting rid of transcendental cause and effect, it's going to affect how we understand things. It's going to reduce knowledge to lower and lower levels. And now it's going to be based on impressions and feelings. And so this creates his famous fork. And notice here Hume's empiricism. Notice this reductionism and mind to sensation and feelings. Now, these are just direct quotes. The most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. This is a reduction of thought. I read that and I'm thinking, okay, well, you're supposed to be smart and that's what you actually think. A dull sensation is better than a most lively thought. Well, remember Solomon, Ecclesiastes. Remember what your eyes see is better, better than what your mind thinks. Anyway, there's a truth in there, but they've gone so much on the other side of it that they reject the knowledge of God, all knowledge of God, all knowledge of Scripture. So we can't solve the problem. Here another quotation. Here, therefore, we may divide all the perceptions of the mind into two classes or species, which are distinguished by their different degrees of forced and vivacity, but vivacious. The less forcible. So again, notice these terms: force and lively. Again, lively. Vitalism, something lively going on here. And I understand here are commonly denominated thoughts and ideas. And then, of course, talks about impression. And then the last one, all ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. Unbelief. The mind has but a slender hold of them. They are apt to be confounded with other resemblings. So, I see this type of discussion throughout his entire book over and over again. The feelings, the impressions, the passions. what the impressions, are they violent or are they mild? This kind of stuff. And so this is part of his experience. See, this is the whole point. Now, Enlightenment in Great Britain, again, as we discussed, was, especially in Scotland, was a little bit more reserved. And in England, a little bit more rebellious. Of course, in Europe, very rebellious. Hume's treatise and inquiry were inspired by John Locke's books. And of course, he wrote a book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. So, but again, Locke was very balanced, okay, in many ways. He's trying to use our transcendental knowledge and scripture to understand the human being and how we relate to the world which God has made. That's Locke's point in his book. Hume is going to get rid of all that stuff. That's too superstitious for him in his view, too transcendental. Locke set out to not only understand the origin of human ideas, but also to decide their certainty based on the evidence of experience, so that logical rationalism was not enough to define what is true. Rational logic must be rooted in empirical reality and sense experience, a good balance. And I agree with that. You can't have someone with a wild imagination and you can make a logical arguments that may make sense and not be inconsistent. But if it is not related to anything real, it's not going to help us. So Locke is a much more balanced. Hume and Kant are going to go against this. Hume's skepticism, however, thus asserted that presumed uniformity of all sense experience is primarily only within the minds. So now, see, they don't believe the world was made by God. See, really, not really. We don't know that. So this creates doubts between your relationship with your mind to the world. So how am I going to interpret that? And so it creates problems. And of course, the cause and effect relationship has now been severed as far as Hume is concerned, to a large extent, at least from anything transcendental. So this is going to create issues there. The natural world does not think, right? Well, God made the natural world to teach us. The heavens declare the glory of God, but it's silent, but it's still, there's some knowledge going on there. There's still some knowledge. But they don't think that because they don't believe really God made a world in that way. In fact, Kant will talk about all the things that are wrong with the world, but everything's crooked. This is why I don't believe in a God, a good God who made the world, because everything I look at is crooked in nature. Yeah, but it gets fallen. And you just admitted it's fallen. And if it's fallen from what? See, he needs to think about that more seriously. He doesn't, even though he talks about it frequently. We'll talk about this later at the end of the lecture. Hume was the most skeptical of an otherwise theist Scottish Enlightenment, featuring especially Thomas Reid, much more like Locke. See, my point here is that you didn't have to go the direction that Hume went. You could have stayed with Locke and with the Scottish Enlightenment. It would have been much better, but of course they didn't. Notice here, Thomas Reid is in agreement with Psalm 19 that he said natural objects suggest themselves to us. And boy, I agree, right? The heavens are declaring the glory of God. There's something that's being taught. Yeah, it may be silent, but they're still teaching you something. That's how God, it's innate. Now, Hume said it was instinctual, okay, but he roots out all transcendence, so not much is going on here. If it's innate and God does it, it's transcendental, and of course, if it's intelligently designed, then we're talking about something tremendous. And Thomas Reid understood that. Even Solomon, he agrees with this too. Proverbs chapter 3 talks about the wisdom of the world. God made the world in wisdom, and therefore, if you want to live in this world, you have to live wisely. Otherwise, the consequences are going to nail you. That's what the book of Proverbs is all about. Chapter 3, also chapter 8 is all about that. Even Job, this is one of my favorite verses on this. And he goes into talk about later how God will destroy the wisdom of the wise if they refuse to acknowledge this basic truth. We've already talked about the reduction of knowledge with the scientific, investigation of things of this world only. And this is dumb things down to the point now we have all this super technology and gadgets, and we have a lot of foolish people doing a lot of foolish things today. The dumbing down of our country, our academy, our universities are related to this problem. Notice, and of course, he makes war against the wise. It says right here in these verses, and this is quoted in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 as well by the Apostle Paul, chapter 1 and 2. But now ask the beasts, Job says this. And of course, he suffered a lot. Why do good people have to suffer? Hume, he got really mad at the scriptural view of God because, we're suffering and God has made me suffer. If how can a good God make me suffer? Well, Job already answered that question as part of experience. Job had a bad experience, but he didn't cave in, did he? And he survived. Of course, God's grace helped him. But now ask the beasts and let them teach you, and the birds of the heavens and let them tell you, or speak of the earth and let it teach you. Notice, nature teaches us something. What does it teach? Among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, and whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind? Does not the ear test words as the palate tastes its food? Of course, the answer is yes. Wisdom was with aged men, long life is understanding. With him are wisdom and might. To him belong counsel and understanding. The book of Job, chapter 12. The Apostle Paul agrees with this too. Romans chapter 1. God teaches us through nature. Interesting. Hume admitted even animals learn cause and effect. We'll talk about this. Let's go back to our notes. Very interesting. Let's take a look at number C. So let's go on to our second page here to our teaching notes. Hume's Empiricism was purposely designed to undercut medieval rationalism based on metaphysical and theological speculations far removed from daily experience. Daily. And of course, we already gave the definitions of rationalism. That's the source. The fill-in term there is source. So the idea of reason is the chief source of all knowledge. A, Catholic scholasticism, rationalism was largely based in Aristotelian philosophical categories, mixed up with medieval theology. Maybe the better term, the more philosophical term, synthesized, we could say. B, René Descartes attempted to cleanse dogmatic rationalism by emphasizing the light of reason from within the subjective self, purged of the existential world around them, including the superstitions as well, because he did not like those things either. And then C, Spinoza and Leibniz, I can't pronounce his name properly. Theological rationalism was very speculative. I was very surprised last year we read Leibniz, and no wonder people like Hume and Kant, rejected they're very abstract, and it was not even close to anything biblical. I was surprised. It's just rationalism that was good logic, but it was rationalism that was off the charts. I mean, it had nothing to do with the real world in which we live. So, I mean, I understand why the empiricists push back against it. They need to push back against that kind of stuff. But now to get God completely out of the picture is just it's radical. I mean, it's extreme. And it's worse than the extreme stuff that you're fighting against. Okay. That's my view on this stuff. Number 2, empiricism. We already gave that definition. Their idea is only through experience. Fill-in term there is only. Lord Bacon is the father of modern empiricism, which based scientific knowledge on observation experimentation. B, John Locke countered Descartes in that he postulated the inner subjective self was a blank slate. Of course, we just reading these verses, God teaches us through nature, requiring sensory experience to teach him through the created world. C, Hume purged Bacon and Locke of their presumed Judeo-Christian superstitions to firmly base all empiricism strictly on human experience alone, without reference to transcendence and or rationalism which extends from it. And so number 1, Hume gutted a priori reasoning. Number 2, he based all knowledge on a posteriori reason, that's experience. 3, Hume's fork divided all knowledge into felt impressions based on brute probable facts of nature and certain ideas, like math. So that was more like the rational part of it. And then, of course, his most important thing was the impressions that you receive based on experience. And that led to postmodernism because our experience is so untrustworthy. And he himself even says that even our senses are not trustworthy in certain areas. And then number 3, Hume's fork eventually divided the Western world between modernism and postmodernism. Now we'll see that right now. Notice here, Hume admitted even animals learn cause and effect. See, this is something which Job tells us that. We already know that. But he said it's strictly by instinct without any transcendence whatsoever. So that reduces the discussion, see. See, God's reason is not at work in animals. It's instinct without transcendence, instinct without God's help, without his maintenance of the world. And that this is the issue. Notice this, these quotations. I was just shocked when I read this, and I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. But anyway, I guess it's real. First, it seems evident that animals as well as men learn many things from experience and infer that the same events will always follow from the same causes. So he doesn't doubt cause and effect per se. It's not a matter of reason. It has nothing to do with transcendence. It's just a matter of fact experience. And of course, that's our interpretation of the mind. By this principle, they have become acquainted with the more obvious properties of external objects and gradually from their birth, treasure up knowledge of nature of fire, water, earth, stones, height, depths, and of effects which are result from this operation. Remember, wisdom lies with aged men. We just read that in the book of Job. Okay. In all these cases, we may observe that the animal infers some. That's interesting. The animal infers. So the animal has something transcendent. I thought you don't believe that. I thought it's strictly, instinctual. Again, there's some problems here. We need to think about this more seriously. He's not thinking about it as seriously as he ought to. So it strikes his senses, and that inference is altogether founded on past experience, while the creature expects from the present object the same consequences, which is always found in observation result from similar objects. So he has reduced cause and effect down. Look at the same thing for animals, same thing for people. That's it. We're just glorified animals is all we are under Hume's empiricism. And without the Bible, without transcendent information coming from the outside in, that's what we are. And not only that, we're fallen. So how can you believe in progress? Now, these are all things that they're not thinking about seriously enough. Animals, therefore, are not guided in these inferences by reasoning. Okay, so now he just says the inference is not reason. So when you infer something yourself, just like the animals, it's the same. It's just instinct. And I'm thinking about this, and I don't understand this. Last year I read Kant, and I'm thinking, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me. I finally realized that it doesn't make sense. Notice the experimental reason itself. It's like an experiment again, experiential. It's all about experiments and experience. Look at it. Everything is just experience. Life's just an experiment. Now, if that's all you got, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. Which we possess in with the beast, on which the whole conduct of life depends, is nothing but a species of instinct or mechanical power. Ooh, okay, mechanical power is now, even mechanics is just instincts now too. Now with the rational mathematics before that, there was some reasoning going on here. A mathematical mind infers some reason and logic, which Hume would agree with. But he's got some strange things going on here. He's reduced even it's just a mechanical power. No logic involved, no reasoning going on here. Though the instincts be different, yet still it is an instinct which teaches a man to avoid the fire as much as that which teaches a bird with such exactness that the art of incubation and the whole economy in order of its nursing. So again, man and nature are equal. We all learn by instinct. Wonderful. By the way, scripture affirms the same thing, right? Ecclesiastes 3:8, 18 to 20, I'm sorry. We are just like the beasts that perish. Right? Without God's word, that's what we are. So there's some truth in what Hume is saying. It's just not all the truth. God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies another. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of descends downward to the earth. Of course, Psalm 49 says the same thing. So there's some truths here, but it's not all the truth. If you take out transcendence, yes, that this is what we have. But what if God did intervene? See, of course, he doesn't believe that. So with knowledge based on experience alone, the fallen world and mind is a basis for truth. Okay, wonderful. We just read a scripture on that. And now we're going to have all kinds of problems here. If the fallen world is basis for your truth, boy, we're in trouble, guys. Everything's crooked, which is what Hume complains about that. Okay, so let's get rid of all transcendence and everything's crooked in this world, and you're going to use that experience as a basis for your truth. Explain this to me. I don't quite understand where we're going to go with that. Hume defines reason as instinct and a slave of passion, which produces only probable knowledge on conventional justice. Okay, so we're there now. The Constitution, for example, in America is just conventional. See, it's just a matter of evolution. See, we're here. And everything going on right now in America is just a big experiment from what I can see. We're all being experimented on right now with this virus situation, big time. Lots of interesting things going on. Slave of the passions. That's what he said. He actually taught that. Reason is a slave of passion. Get used to it. And by the way, he based it on real experience. Of course, but that's the problem. People use their reason to serve themselves and their own passions. And the Bible says that's the problem. You need to fix that with the word of God. Not with reason and rationalism per se, but with God's word. That's how you fix it. The word of God will protect the heart. Anyway, there are all kinds of verses like that, not verses, but quotations in Hume's book. And I'm just reading this. I'm thinking, my gosh, does he really believe that? Yeah, he does. Anyway, and of course, duty and honor, these are things that Hume would think they're very unfeeling. So he's a romantic. Kant, kind of went the other way. At least Kant had some sense of honor. For Hume, your ethics is wrapped up in feelings, and he's going to lay the foundations for Schleiermacher. That what is religion? It's a feeling of absolute dependence. It's a feeling, and of course, it's wrapped up with your passions, altruism, sympathy, cooperation, do-gooder type stuff. So that's going to be his ethics. It's based on what he observed today, and of course, he gives all kinds of strange arguments. It reminded me back when I read in Evergreen State College, all of the books we read, Aristotle's Ethics, and even some discussions with Plato. We did a big study in the classical world. And so Hume's kind of going back to that a little bit, looking at man from that point of view without any biblical worldview. And boy, it's not a world that I can go along with, but of course he believes it and he's going to go with it. So again, nature, experience, transcendence teaches man only through custom and instinct. So, this is a part of the problem. Okay, even Kant and even Hume has some transcendence. You cannot get away from it. So if you can't get away from it, well, let's go back to it, guys. Nature for Kant was transcendent. For Hume was transcendent. Custom was transcendent for Hume. So there's a little bit of transcendence, and they think that that's okay. Well, if there's a little bit of transcendence, maybe there's more. See, well, once you admit it, okay, it's hard to keep once you let the cat out of the bag, the cat's out. But they don't seem to get a hold of that. But come on, look at it. If nature teaches me and custom teaches me, there must something above me is teaching me something. And if you've let the cat out of the bag, okay, let's rethink something. Let's go back to some of the things that John Locke was saying here. I think would help us. So again, this is a contradiction. Nature is still semi-transcendent in Hume's system. Kant, basically, he called it transcendental idealism, because he knew that Hume he recognized you can't root out all transcendentalism. In fact, he talked about, here's a philosophy of metaphysics. Of course, it's rooted in experience. Kant. Hume just ignored it. And so Kant realized that's an extreme statement. We got to fix this. But then Kant's going to create other problems because he took Hume too seriously. So again, how do you progress without transcendence? This is a problem, and it's a problem with the whole empirical system. We got our idea of transcendence from the progress. The idea of progressive comes from the Bible. We start at the beginning, we go to the end. We start in the Old Testament, go to the New Testament. That which is newest is best, better than the old. That's a biblical concept. And now we've rooted that out from all transcendence. And now it's strictly a matter of gadgets and computer games and coronaviruses now. That's our progress now. Evolution, politics, socialism, communism, National Socialism, all those things, whatever, fascism and all those things, all the isms you can think of. And everybody looks forward to the future. Why would you do that? Why, okay, most people aren't going to make it there. They've already died. And let's say someone dies of a heart attack, before the so-called good times come, utopia. What are you going to do with that guy? Or how about everybody that's ever lived? See, the idea of a progressive view of history requires a resurrection to make sense. That's why Christianity, the Bible, has a progressive view of history. But it's on a transcendental plane. And part of that is, of course, it is rooted in history too, but it has the answer to the problem through the resurrection of Christ. And that's why Christianity has a line. And we have forgotten all this. So we've gotten rid of all the transcendence. So now we're left with this line. We're going to utopia based on politics, taxes, and social experiments, and now medical experiments on top of that too. I mean, these are huge inconsistencies, and back in those days, Hume didn't even think about such things. Here, Hume tried. He, I read this and over again, and I'm thinking, I kept on reading it, these quotes, and this does not make sense to me. But anyway, and I just finally realized it doesn't make sense, and so I just left it. But what he's trying to do is saying, look at the things that you see out in the world. They're not cause and effect per se. We don't know that. You can't prove it, but we can prove that they're conjoined in some way, that they're related to each other. How they're related, that's a different question. He doubts that many things are actually at the end of the day are based on really cause and effect. They're related to each other, but exactly how they're related, we can't know that, because he presumes that most cause and effect relationships are based in some form of transcendence. So he basically teaches some kind of a strange coexistence of ideas, coexistence of relationship between things. They may or may not be cause and effect. We can't see it per se. We experience it. See, by when I said see, I mean in the sense of perceive it, because again, cause and effect is presumed to be transcendent. Interesting. So they've admitted that. Well, maybe it is. So let's go back to it then. That's my opinion. Let's be more like Locke. But anyway, that's another story. So lots of strange things going on here. I read these verses. I mean, I'm sorry, these quotations. I'm reading too much Bible. I'm just thinking, wow, these are strange comments. Hume complicates cause and effect. Notice here, we may therefore consider the relation of contiguity, that's that, they're together, they're conjoined, as essential to that of causation. But to him, it's more important that they're related to each other. So what's important is the coexistence of these things rather than causality per se. So the coexistence dominates the causality. See, that's sort of the point. In the old rational system, the causality really plays a bigger role. See, he's reversed it. The second relation I shall observe as essential to causes and effects is not to be universally acknowledged, but is liable to some controversy, is that of priority of time and cause before the effect. For if one cause were cotemporary with its effect, this effect with its effect, and so on, 'tis plain there would be no such thing as succession. Well, of course, you have to have time. Yeah, he says you have to have some things there going on in order to show cause and effect, which of course that's true. And some of those things see are transcendent. See, in fact, Kant even said that time was almost transcendent. So anyway, lots of interesting discussions here. But notice here, the probabilities are of several kinds, he says. They're all derived from the same origin, the association of ideas to a present impression. So now we're back to impressions. As the habit, okay, that's that custom, which produces the association. They may or may not be cause and effect. You can't prove that. Logically, it's kind of his point. Arises from the frequent conjunction of objects. It must arrive at its perfection by degrees. So you can maybe prove something through experimentation over time, but even then, that's just based on custom. So the scientific revolution now is just based on custom now and not absolute truth. And of course, we're in this deep now, big time. Scriptural cause and effect talks about some of these things too, but the scripture goes back and forth between transcendental causes and causes that exist on this earth that are actually physical. Notice especially Ecclesiastes 11:3. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north or wherever the tree falls, there it lies. So there you go. Cause and effect according to the Bible. There's maybe Hume would almost agree with that. But notice Proverbs 21:31. The horse is prepared for the day of battle, but victory belongs to the Lord. So there's a lot of causes that we don't know about, which again, I would agree with Hume on that, but he's thrown out all causes. We don't know them, so let's just forget it. Okay. A horse is a false hope for victory, nor does it deliver anyone by its great strength. Ecclesiastes 9:11, I again saw under the sun, the race is not to the swift, the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability, for time and chance overtake them all. There's a lot of causes that go on out there that we know are from the providence of God. And yes, you cannot know those things, but that doesn't mean it's not real. And of course, we have an angelic conflict we know is going on out there too. The book of Job talks about the suffering that he went, the unjust suffering he went through thanks to the angelic conflict. The Bible does talk about these things. Anyway, we have to make choices here. So the scriptures also teach the hiddenness of ultimate causes and their effects, which is what Kant and Hume are all into. Okay, but not all of them. So they're being too radical. They're going too far with this. Hume's cause and effect is based on metaphysics of the mind only. It's kind of like he's going to, basically turn experience into the only metaphysics there is. And Kant did that too, but he raised it a little bit higher. So, it's just, it's a matter of my interpretation. And the interpretation, this is where things get sticky. He doesn't necessarily deny cause and effect. It's just all based on interpretation. And you don't know the ultimate causes. And of course, there's many different causes out, millions of them. So, for what direction are they coming from, you don't know. And so we don't really know these things. So we can just stay back in our agnosticism. And we can talk about the conjunction of ideas a lot. And we can learn a lot. Let's just stay with that. And then, the cause and effect we may be able to establish through experimentation. The more we see of it, the more chances are it's a truth, but it's, again, conventional. So this was basically Hume's view, on cause and effect. And he's trying to do this to get back at the transcendental nature of rationalism. He wants to get rid of that stuff so he can focus on this world itself. And so the cause and effect is strictly based on experience, instincts, custom, and convention. And of course, he removes all a priori reasoning from cause and effect, which is the whole point of Hume's philosophy. But Kant does the same thing almost as well. Very similar. Kant, of course, loved this, but of course, he tried to correct Hume, as we already discussed. And Hume sort of he wants to apply the same. We talked about this earlier a little bit. The same whole discussion about the the science of cosmology changed to how we look at the heliocentric view of the universe now. Now the Earth revolves around the sun. Well, Hume said, let's now do the same type of thing with regard to the philosophy. Let's talk about man experience. And so Kant's going to do the same thing. So they're going to, rather than talk about God and let's just talk about transcendent things we don't know about, let's talk about ourselves. Let's talk about this world and things that we really know. So they're going to root themselves more and more into this world. Of course, the book of Revelation calls them earth dwellers coming up. And, people are getting more rooted into the earth more and more all the time, especially through the environmental movement, nature worship, all kinds of things going on. So these things, experience alone, we devolve. We sink into the world in which we live without any transcendent answers from the outside. And of course, they plead ignorance. We don't know these things, so we can't know them. And by the way, human history is full of at least a belief in transcendence. We need to take this more seriously. They're playing ignorant. They're playing, look at the end of the day, when you go to see the judge, you say, well, I didn't know about that particular law. I broke it. I'm sorry, but I didn't know about it. So I'm therefore not liable. That argument's not going to work. And it's going to be the same with God at the end of the day as well. Hume believed that cause and effect rationalism and natural theology lead to determinism. This was one of the reasons why even Kant also were trying to get to sully this cause and effect, because this Calvinism type stuff, well, we don't want this, and everything is fatalistic. We need to put a stop to that. So this is also part of the argument. In fact, it may be the real reason they're pushing back against cause and effect, because too many Calvinists, strict Calvinists, were using cause and effect against everything that's going on. And I understand the problems here, but still, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in my point of view. So Hume's customary natural theology as nature and custom are transcendental guides relative to faith and fact. We've already talked about that. So nature can teach me and convention can teach me, but again, it's all based on experience and instincts alone. So that knowledge, again, is going to be limited. This type of science is very reductionistic. And I think with the intelligent design stuff coming out today, that's not reduction is actually going the other way around now. People are seeing the incredible design of especially the human body. What's going on inside the cell is just incredible. And I recently read an article too, not long ago, where they've actually, not only have they cracked into this human cell at the microscopic level, but now they are starting to take pictures of inside the atom now too. Anyway, there's lots that could be said here. We could spend a lot of time here. But again, the reduction of knowledge to experience, sheer experience without any transcendence whatsoever, is just not a good thing to do. It leads to existentialism. It leads to postmodernism. I don't know anything. It's all based on convention. Well, I hope so. Yeah, relatively speaking, this is generally true. And that's the best we got. So Humean faith and existence. So he has a faith in existence. That's interesting. He's a sort of a deist, agnostic romantic of sorts. Belief is nothing but a more vivid, notice that these romantic terms, lively, forcible, firm, steady conception of an object than the imagination alone is ever able to maintain. So again, it's all based on experience. Belief is something felt by the mind, again. It seems evident that men are carried by a natural instinct or prepossession to repose faith in their senses. See, this is instinct. Faith in existence, the senses. Without any reasoning, or even almost before the use of reason, we always suppose an external universe. Again, with God, you can explain this. Without God, it's hard to explain, but he does. And of course, he doesn't have a problem with it in his point of view, but I think there's many problems with this. It seems also evident that when they followed this blind and powerful instinct of nature, they always supposed the very images presented by the senses to be external objects. Well, okay. I think this is instinct, of course, but it's instincts created by God, which therefore raise it back up to a transcendental level. But they've reduced everything. Hume's doubt in cause and effect leads to doubts in historical testimony too. Basically, it's the same argument all over again with regard to scriptural testimony. And of course, even doubting history, there's so many millions of causes that occur. We don't know, we can't possibly know what they all are. So again, this is part of the same discussion. So now he doubts scriptural testimony as well. Hume's view on biblical miracles reduced to superstition based on present experience. And of course, he had all these Christians, Catholics telling him, I had this miracle, I saw this, lightning struck me, and all this kind of stuff. And so he rejected all that type of stuff for all miracles of the Bible as well. And of course, he made these comments about, only an idiot would believe these things. Well, look at the scriptures. If you look carefully at the Bible, Moses was not an idiot. He was a lawgiver. And now even we've come some archaeological evidence is starting to show even some things with the Exodus generation now, with regard to what happened at the Exodus. There are some hints now that were not there before. Keep in mind, Hume lived before archaeology. So his doubts here have been basically not confirmed. Daniel, he was a prince in Babylon. He was not, and but they have found archaeological evidence of Daniel in Babylon. Of course, Jesus, C.S. Lewis made the famous argument, Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or he's a son of God. He can't be one of the, he has to be one or the other. You can't mix them up, can't be both. If he's he claimed to be the son of God and he's not, he's either a liar or lunatic. So he can't be all three. And many people, even Thomas Jefferson is a deist, for example, everybody respects Jesus. I assume Hume did too, but still, Luke has now been shown to be one of the best historians of the ancient world. So a lot of Hume's doubt, and of course he was a medical doctor, by the way. So a lot of these doubts that Hume has is more related to his own time and some of the struggles they were going through. They had hangovers from Calvinism, hangovers from the Catholic Church, hangovers from pagan superstition that was working through Aristotle's stuff. And so now they wanted to get away from this stuff and purify the world from all transcendence. Let's just focus on this world alone. Well, that leads to all kinds of problems too. It doesn't help anything. It makes things worse. Of course, he has a bad view of the Pentateuch. Dr. Tynus Kennedy now has some really good stuff out there, and archaeologically speaking, that deals with. They even found a document, ancient Egyptian document, that talks about going back to the same time as the Egyptian Passover, where it talks about how a series of terrible natural disasters ruined Egypt. They actually found a written document that's not even biblical saying the same thing. The only difference is the order, but basically it's the same. So again, you can sit and doubt all those things, but archaeology has basically confirmed a lot of things with regard to the historicity of the Bible. And by the way, like I talked about earlier, the miracles have great meaning in the Bible. And you look at all the historical testimony that's given in Scripture, and if the prophets and all of the apostles and even some of the Moses or Daniel, whoever it may be, if they give dates that are fairly accurate, that generally have now been confirmed. If they're so good with history, little minor details, what about the miracles? Well, maybe they are too. Hume's prejudice against resurrection fully revealed in Queen Elizabeth's conjecture. He tried to come up with some scheme where Queen Elizabeth died, faked her death, and then came out later. And, with this, so he's tried to come up with some conjecture about, if this actually happened. Okay, well, you can't do that. The resurrection of Christ. First of all, Jesus was crucified. We know this is a fact. Anybody who's crucified is not going to live. You can't fake his own death. That's impossible. And of course, the historical arguments now for the resurrection of Christ are pretty strong these days. You can at least prove, I think, without a doubt, that the tomb was empty. And if you start to think about it more seriously, you realize, okay, empty tomb requires a resurrection to make the best sense. So again, Hume's doubts have not been confirmed. And Hume spends all this time talking about a fallen world. I mean, I'm just looking at this guy. Come on. Okay, you've just admitted we live in a fallen world. Let's think about this more seriously. If the world is fallen, what is it fallen from? Okay, and if this world is fallen, well, maybe miracles do exist if it's fallen from something from something miraculous, perhaps. All this might astonish me, that the knavery and folly of men are such common phenomena, that I should rather believe the most extraordinary events to arise from their concurrence and admit of so a signal a violation of laws of nature. So he's just said the laws of nature, men are a bunch of idiots. And of course, he's based his philosophy on that. His whole empirical enterprise, experiments based on people serve their passions. They use reason to serve their passions. Boy, oh boy. Let your gods, therefore, O philosophers, be suited to the present appearance of nature. See, it's fallen. And presume not to alter these appearances by arbitrary suppositions in order to suit them to the attributes which you so fondly describe your deities. Leibniz was a problem. He talked about a good God making a perfect world. And of course, you look around, the world isn't perfect. What's the matter with you guys? You need to show how, yeah, God made a good world, but we have the second law of thermodynamics is also going on. What's going on? How do we get there? Let's focus on that. But they didn't do that. They forgot about the fall and their reason. So they forgot about the scriptures, and they forgot about the fall of mankind. And I think if you start looking at the world around you more empirically and more seriously, you realize, like Mr. Hume admits, the world's pretty fallen. You don't need a Bible verse to back it up. Just look around, open the eyes. They have no reason to ascribe to these celestial beings any perfection or any attribute but what can be found in the present world. Okay, he's just admitted the world is fallen. He does this all the time in his book. And I'm thinking, guy, okay. Let's think about this more seriously. And he just goes on and on about this. Lots of good quotes. We could spend a lot of time. We don't have the time. Man is most unfortunate, nature's economy. Then, of course, this is part of his social, issues and the politics and the economics. Okay, yeah, there's some things to be talked about there. Today, every country in the world has massive economic debt that's off the charts right now. It's almost apocalyptic. We're all probably close to Armageddon from what I can tell. This is empirical. Anyway, we could talk about that. So he has these skeptical conclusions because a lot of it goes back to cause and effect, and he's trying to get rid of transcendental, a priori cause and effect. When you do that, it leads to, a reduction of knowledge, and now everything's rooted on this fallen experience, and everything, therefore, your truth is going to be pretty distorted and crooked truth. And if you're happy with that, I guess then that you can be that. And I guess that's what he was. And we become like the beast that perish, as Solomon warns us of. Yet here, notice here, interesting. Hume admits Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9. But besides that, the ordinary course of nature may convince us that almost everything is regulated by principles and maxims very different from ours. Besides this, I say it must evidently appear contrary to all rules of analogy to reason, from the intentions of the projects of men to those of a being so different and so much superior. He admits God here. Notice Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So he admits Isaiah 55 through his own experience. Okay, well, let's take the more serious. The Bible is a very experiential book, Mr. Hume. The Bible is a very historical book, Mr. Hume. But let's take it more seriously. Let's get back to basics. Jesus even talks about that, right? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak that which we know, and we bear witness of that which we have seen. And you do not receive our witness. See, Jesus became a man to solve all of Hume's problems. If I told you earthly things you don't believe, and of course, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus about being born from water. He says, how can I tell you heavenly things? And no one has ascended into heaven, even the Son of Man. But no one has ascended into heaven, but he who descended from heaven, even the Son of Man. So God became a man to solve that problem. No one's been to heaven. So we can't start from ourselves and work our way up to heaven to know anything. But yes, Jesus came down to us. And by the way, a lot of these things have been historically verified as God has revealed himself historically throughout the entire Bible from cover to cover now. Almost every generation time period has been established and confirmed by archaeology. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him have eternal life. So that is my lecture on David Hume. And I hope that it's been helpful. Let's finish up our notes. Let's go back to our teaching notes, and notice number 2, very simple here. Roman numeral number 2, Hume's empiricism was largely based on complicating and critiquing the cause-effect relationship presumed sacrosanct in scholasticism and rationalism for centuries. Number A, for Hume, cause and effect are not based on a priori reason, but upon a posteriori, experience, instinct, and custom. B, Hume thus believed he undercut all metaphysics based on a priori cause and effect rational arguments. C, both Hume and Kant believed that when cause and effect understand rationally and metaphysically, it leads to a world of strict determinism which cannot be free. Interesting point. Number D, through millions of unknown causes and effects, historical knowledge is thus suspect at best, particularly with regard to the miraculous history of the Bible. So this was Hume's 2 books, famous books, A Treatise of Human Nature, an essay concerning human understanding. I've done my best. It was a big struggle to go through these 2 books, but I hope that I imparted some information here on what was going on, sort of the primary ideas and the primary troubles, the primary concerns that David Hume had and why he did what he did at the time in which he lived. And I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much.